Have you ever wondered how a single moment of courage can change not just your life, but the lives of thousands of others? Sometimes the most ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary situations, where a simple choice between right and wrong becomes the defining moment of their existence. This is the story of Emily Parker, a 26-year-old receptionist working at a small law firm in downtown Chicago. Emily had always considered herself unremarkable, just another face in the crowd, someone who followed rules and kept her head down. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer someday, but those dreams felt distant and almost impossible given her financial situation. What Emily didn't know was that on one seemingly ordinary Thursday afternoon, a stranger would walk through the doors of Ross & Associates, and her decision to stand up for what she believed was right would set in motion events that would not only transform her own future, but potentially save thousands of lives.
The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Ross & Associates as Emily Parker organized a stack of legal documents on her reception desk. The small law firm occupied the third floor of an aging brick building, and the steady patter of raindrops had become the soundtrack to another quiet Thursday afternoon. Emily glanced at the clock. 4:30 p.m. In just 30 minutes, she could lock up and head home to her small studio apartment, where leftover pasta and a stack of LSAT prep books awaited her. Emily had been working as a receptionist at the firm for nearly 2 years now. It wasn't her dream job, but it paid the bills and gave her insight into the legal world she hoped to join someday. Attorney Michael Ross, the firm's owner, was a decent boss who handled mostly civil cases, personal injury claims, contract disputes, and the occasional divorce. The work was steady, but hardly glamorous. She adjusted her cardigan and returned to entering client information into the computer system. Ross & Associates wasn't a large firm by any means. Besides Emily and attorney Ross, there was only one part-time paralegal, Sandra, who came in 3 days a week. The office itself was modest: a small lobby with Emily's desk, attorney Ross's private office, a conference room that doubled as a storage space, and a tiny break room that barely fit a coffee maker and a mini refrigerator. Emily had grown up in a working-class family in suburban Chicago. Her parents had worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, and when it came time for college, Emily had taken out significant student loans to earn her bachelor's degree in political science from a state school. The loans were still a heavy burden, and law school seemed like an impossible financial mountain to climb. That's why she had taken the job at Ross & Associates, to save money while gaining experience in the legal field she hoped to join someday. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Emily answered with her practiced professional voice, scheduling an appointment for a client dealing with a landlord dispute. As she hung up, she noticed attorney Ross emerging from his office, briefcase in hand and coat draped over his arm. At 42, Michael Ross was a competent attorney who had built his small practice through hard work and attention to detail. He was fair to Emily, though sometimes she felt he saw her merely as office furniture, someone to answer phones and file paperwork, not someone with legal aspirations of her own. Attorney Ross paused at her desk, checking his watch. He was a man of routine, always leaving the office at exactly 5 p.m. unless there was an emergency. His thinning brown hair was perfectly combed, and his tie was always straight. He took pride in maintaining a professional appearance, even if his office building was far from the gleaming downtown towers where the big law firms operated. The afternoon had been typically quiet. A few phone calls, some document filing, and the usual administrative tasks that kept the small firm running. Emily had used the slow periods to study for the LSAT, keeping her prep book hidden beneath a stack of legal files. She had been taking practice tests for months, dreaming of the day she could afford to apply to law school. Her scores were improving, but the financial reality of law school tuition remained daunting. Every point on the LSAT could mean the difference between thousands of dollars in additional debt or the possibility of a full scholarship. As she organized her desk for the end of the day, she reflected on how her life had become predictable. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., arrive at the office by 8 a.m., handle calls and paperwork until 5 p.m., then go home to study and worry about her future. She had few friends. Most of her college classmates had moved away or were too busy with their own careers to maintain regular contact. Her social life consisted mainly of occasional dinners with her parents and weekend trips to the library. Sometimes she wondered if she was wasting her potential in this small office. She had graduated with honors and had always been told she was smart and capable, but intelligence and capability didn't automatically translate into opportunity, especially when you didn't have family connections or financial resources to open doors. She had applied to several larger law firms for paralegal positions, but most required experience she didn't have, or were willing to pay only marginally more than what she was already earning. The rain continued to patter against the windows as Emily prepared for another evening of LSAT preparation. She had scheduled her test for December, giving herself 2 more months to improve her score. Her goal was to score high enough to qualify for merit-based scholarships, though she knew the competition would be fierce. Every point on the LSAT could mean the difference between thousands of dollars in additional debt or the possibility of a full scholarship. Attorney Ross gathered his things and headed toward the door, reminding Emily to lock up properly and turn on the security system. The evening cleaning crew would arrive around 6 p.m., so Emily usually stayed until they arrived to let them in. It was part of her routine, one of the small responsibilities that came with being the firm's only full-time support staff. As 5 p.m. approached, Emily began her closing routine. She powered down her computer, organized the files that needed Attorney Ross's attention the next morning, and prepared to arm the security system. The office would be quiet until 8 a.m. the next day, when Emily would arrive to start another day that she assumed would be much like this one. She had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, everything would change. The ordinary Thursday that had felt so predictable, so mundane, was about to become the most significant day of her life. Sometimes destiny arrives not with fanfare and drama, but through the simple act of someone walking through a door, bringing with them a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, justice, and the power of doing what is right.
At 4:55 p.m., just as Emily was reaching for her coat, the front door of Ross & Associates opened with an urgency that made her look up immediately. The man who entered was soaked from the rain, his graying hair plastered to his head and water dripping from his worn jacket onto the office carpet. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with weathered hands and clothes that had seen better days. His jeans were frayed at the edges, his sneakers had holes that let in the rain, and his jacket was the kind you might find at a thrift shop. But it was his eyes that caught Emily's attention. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was an intelligence there, a sharpness that seemed inconsistent with his overall presentation. He looked around the office with the quick, assessing gaze of someone who was accustomed to evaluating situations rapidly. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing back at the door as if he expected someone to follow him. James Wilson stood in the lobby, dripping and clearly agitated. He clutched a manila folder against his chest as if it contained the most precious thing in the world. The folder was worn and bent, held together with rubber bands, and stuffed with what appeared to be numerous documents. Emily noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold, nerves, or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. Emily set down her coat and approached the front desk with a professional smile, despite the fact that it was closing time and this unexpected visitor looked like he might be trouble. In her 2 years at the firm, she had learned to remain courteous even when dealing with difficult or unusual situations. Some of the firm's clients came from challenging circumstances, and Emily had developed a reputation for being patient and understanding. James approached her desk hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure he belonged in a law office. He glanced around the modest lobby, taking in the simple furniture, the stack of legal magazines, and the framed law degree on the wall behind Emily's desk. His nervousness was palpable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and kept adjusting his grip on the precious folder. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if he had been talking extensively, or perhaps hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. He explained that he needed legal help urgently, that he had information about something important, something that could affect many people. But when Emily asked about his ability to pay attorney fees, James's shoulders sagged. He admitted that he had no money, no insurance, and no way to compensate the firm for their services. Emily felt a familiar pang of sympathy.
She had grown up in a household where money was always tight, where her parents sometimes had to choose between paying bills and addressing other needs. She understood what it felt like to need help but lack the resources to pay for it. However, she also knew that Ross and Associates was a small firm that couldn't afford to take on numerous pro bono cases. Just as Emily was trying to figure out how to handle the situation diplomatically, Attorney Ross emerged from his office. He had been preparing to leave when he heard voices in the lobby and came out to investigate. Ross took one look at James, the wet clothes, the desperate expression, the worn folder, and Emily could see his assessment happening in real time. This was not the kind of client who would help the firm's bottom line. Ross's demeanor shifted immediately into what Emily recognized as his polite but firm dismissal mode. He explained that the firm's schedule was fully booked, that they weren't currently accepting new pro bono cases, and that James might want to try the Legal Aid Society downtown. His tone was professional but clearly final. This conversation was over before it had really begun. Emily watched as James's face fell. The hope that had brought him through the rain and into their office was visibly draining away. He clutched his folder tighter and nodded slowly as if he had expected this response but had hoped for something different. The disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable, and Emily found herself wondering what was in that folder that seemed so important to him. As Ross continued his polite but firm refusal, Emily noticed more details about James. Despite his shabby appearance, he spoke with a certain education and precision that suggested he hadn't always been in difficult circumstances. His posture, even when defeated, had a certain dignity to it that spoke of someone who had once held positions of responsibility. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the profile of the typical walk-in client seeking free legal services. James began to back toward the door, thanking them for their time and apologizing for the inconvenience. But Emily noticed that his hands were still shaking, and not just from the cold. There was a fear there, a desperation that went beyond simple disappointment at being turned away. He kept glancing toward the windows as if he expected to see something or someone outside. Emily found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Her boss had made his decision clear, and as a receptionist, she had no authority to override that decision. Her job was to support Attorney Ross's choices, not to question them. But something about James's situation was nagging at her. Maybe it was the way he held that folder, or maybe it was the intelligence she saw in his eyes, or simply the basic human decency that had been instilled in her by parents who had taught her to help others when possible. As James reached for the door handle, Emily made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked him to wait just a moment and then requested a private word with Attorney Ross. Ross looked annoyed at the delay. He had a dinner reservation and wanted to leave the office on schedule, but Emily's serious expression convinced him to step into his office for a brief conversation. In Ross's office, Emily found herself in the unusual position of advocating for a complete stranger. She admitted that she didn't know the details of James's situation, but argued that they should at least hear him out before dismissing him entirely. She pointed out that the firm occasionally took pro bono cases, and that sometimes those cases led to referrals or other business opportunities. Ross's response was sharp and immediate. He reminded Emily that she was a receptionist, not a lawyer, and that business decisions were hers to make. He explained the financial realities of running a small law firm, the overhead costs, and the necessity of focusing on cases that could actually pay the bills. His tone made it clear that he considered this conversation over and that Emily had overstepped her bounds. But something in Emily refused to back down. Maybe it was the memory of her own family struggles, or maybe it was simply an instinct that told her that James's situation was more than it appeared to be. She found herself arguing more forcefully than she had ever had with her boss, insisting that they had a moral obligation to at least listen to what James had to say. The conversation was heading toward a confrontation that could very well cost Emily her job. Ross was clearly frustrated with what he saw as insubordination from an employee who was supposed to support his decisions, not challenge them. But Emily felt as if she had reached a point where she couldn't simply watch James walk away without knowing what was in that folder and why he was so frightened. Outside in the lobby, James waited by the door, still clutching his folder and glancing nervously at the windows. He had no idea that his fate was being decided in a heated conversation between a determined receptionist and his increasingly angry boss. The rain continued to fall, and the clock on the wall showed 5:10 p.m., well past normal closing time. The ordinary Thursday was becoming anything but ordinary, and the decisions made in the next few minutes would set in motion events that would change multiple lives forever.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The tension in Attorney Ross's office was palpable as Emily faced her boss across his mahogany desk. Ross's face was flushed with irritation, his typically perfect composure cracking under what he clearly viewed as an inappropriate challenge to his authority. Emily had never spoken to him this way before. In fact, she had never spoken to any employer this way. But something about James's desperation and the fear she had seen in his eyes compelled her to push forward, even though she could feel her job slipping away with every word. Ross leaned back in his chair, his voice ticking on the controlled tone he used when cross-examining difficult witnesses. He explained to Emily that running a law firm wasn't a charity operation, that every hour spent on unpaid work was an hour taken away from paying clients who kept the lights on and paid her salary. He reminded her that she had student loans to pay and bills to meet, and that her job at the firm was what made that possible. Emily felt her heart racing as she listened to Ross's logical arguments. Everything he was saying made perfect sense from a business perspective. She was a receptionist with no legal training, no authority to make case decisions, and no right to challenge her employer's judgment. Her role was to schedule appointments, answer phones, and support the firm's operations, not to advocate for strangers who walked in off the street. But despite the logical voice in her head telling her to apologize and drop the matter, Emily found herself thinking about the folder James had been clutching. She thought about the way he had looked around the office with intelligence and assessment, despite his shabby appearance. Most importantly, she thought about the fear in his eyes. Not the fear of someone trying to scam the system, but the genuine terror of someone who was in real danger. Emily took a deep breath and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She told Attorney Ross that she understood his position and respected his business concerns, but that she believed they were making a mistake. She argued that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks, and that as lawyers, even though she wasn't technically a lawyer yet, they had a responsibility to justice that went beyond simple profit margins. Ross's patience finally snapped. He stood up from his chair and informed Emily that she was way out of line. He reminded her that he had built this firm from nothing, that he had taken risks and made sacrifices to create a successful practice, and that he didn't need lectures about responsibility from a receptionist who had been working in the legal field for less than 2 years. His voice raised slightly as he told Emily that if she wanted to play lawyer, she should go to law school and start her own practice. The words stung because they hit so close to Emily's own insecurities. She was acutely aware that she was just a receptionist, that she didn't have a law degree or the authority to make these kinds of decisions. She knew that Ross had every right to be angry with her insubordination. But she also knew that if she backed down now, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Emily surprised herself by remaining calm despite Ross's anger. She acknowledged that he was right about her position and her lack of authority, but she also told him that she had been observing the legal profession for 2 years and that she had seen how the system sometimes failed people who needed help the most. She explained that she wasn't trying to undermine his business or question his expertise. She was simply asking him to listen to one man's story for 10 minutes. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Ross growing increasingly frustrated and Emily becoming more determined. Through the office window, she could see James still waiting in the lobby, still clutching his folder and glancing nervously at the door. The rain had intensified, and the office felt isolated from the outside world, as if this conversation was happening in its own bubble of importance. Finally, Emily played what she knew might be her last card. She told Ross that she would take personal responsibility for the time spent with James.
If his case turned out to be frivolous, or if he was wasting their time, she would work late to make up the lost hours without additional compensation. She would handle any administrative work related to the case on her own time. She was essentially asking Ross to let her gamble her own time and effort on a stranger's story. Ross stared at Emily for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out what had gotten into her typically compliant receptionist. Emily had always been reliable and professional, never causing problems or challenging his decisions. This sudden display of determination was completely out of character, and Ross found himself wondering what she was seeing that he wasn't. The silence stretched between them as Ross weighed his options. He could simply fire Emily for insubordination and be done with the entire situation. He could stand firm on his decision and force her to back down, or he could give her the benefit of the doubt and invest 10 minutes in listening to James's story. The practical businessman in him said to end this conversation and send James away. But something about Emily's passionate defense of a complete stranger gave him pause. Emily watched Ross's face carefully, trying to read his decision in his expression. She realized that she had pushed their professional relationship to its breaking point, and there might be no going back, regardless of how this conversation ended. She had revealed a side of herself that she hadn't even known existed, a willingness to fight for what she believed was right, even when it meant risking everything she had worked for. After what felt like an eternity, Ross let out a long sigh and looked at his watch. He told Emily that she had put him in an impossible position. He couldn't simply ignore her concerns after such a passionate argument, but he also couldn't set a precedent of letting employees override his business decisions. He was clearly struggling with competing priorities, maintaining his authority as the boss, while also recognizing that Emily's instincts had been reliable in the past. Ross finally made his decision. He would give James exactly 10 minutes to explain his situation. If the story was compelling and the case had merit, they would consider taking it on. But if James was wasting their time, or if his situation was not something the firm could handle, Emily would need to accept that decision without further argument. Additionally, Emily would indeed be responsible for any administrative work related to the case, and she would need to manage her regular duties alongside any additional responsibilities. Emily felt a mixture of relief and terror as Ross agreed to her request. She had won this battle, but she realized that she had also committed herself to something she didn't fully understand. She had no idea what James's story would be, whether his case had any merit, or whether she had just risked her career for someone who might indeed be wasting their time. All she knew was that her instincts were telling her that James needed their help, and that walking away without listening would be wrong. As they prepared to return to the lobby, Ross warned Emily that this was a one-time exception, and that she should never again challenge his decisions in this manner. He made it clear that her job was still on the line, and that if James's case proved to be frivolous, there would be serious consequences for her presumption in overriding his judgment. Emily nodded, accepting the terms even though she felt her hands shaking with nervous energy. She had just bet her entire career on a stranger's story, and in a few minutes, she would find out whether her instincts were right or whether she had made the biggest mistake of her professional life. As they walked back toward the lobby, Emily took a deep breath and prepared to face the consequences of her decision to stand up for what she believed was right.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
James was still standing near the door when Emily and Attorney Ross emerged from the private office. His wet clothes had left a small puddle on the carpet, and his grip on the manila folder had tightened during the time he had been waiting. Emily noticed that he looked even more nervous than before, as if the delay had given him time to second-guess his decision to seek help. His eyes darted between Emily and Ross, trying to read their expressions and gauge whether there was any hope left in this situation. Attorney Ross approached James with a professional demeanor he used for initial client consultations, though Emily could detect an underlying skepticism in his voice. He explained that they could spare a few minutes to hear James's situation, but that he needed to be direct and concise about what kind of legal help he was seeking. Ross's tone made it clear that this was a courtesy, not a commitment,
and that James shouldn't assume anything beyond this brief conversation. James nodded gratefully and followed them into the small conference room. Emily noticed that he chose the chair closest to the door, positioning himself where he could see both the entrance to the room and the windows that looked out onto the street. His behavior suggested someone who was genuinely concerned about his safety, not someone putting on an act for sympathy. He placed the precious folder on the table in front of him, but kept his hands protectively near it. When James began to speak, Emily immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. The nervous, desperate man from the lobby transformed into someone with a clear narrative and specific details. His voice became steadier, more focused, and the intelligence Emily had glimpsed in his eyes became more apparent. James explained that until 6 months ago, he had been a senior quality inspector for Meridian Construction, one of the largest construction companies in the Midwest. James's story unfolded with the precision of someone who had spent months thinking about every detail. Meridian Construction had built a reputation for completing large public projects on time and under budget. They had contracts for schools, hospitals, municipal buildings, and infrastructure projects across 3 states. James had been with the company for 8 years, working his way up from a junior inspector to a senior position where he was responsible for ensuring that all materials and construction methods met safety standards in building codes. As James continued his account, Emily found herself leaning forward, captivated by the story. About a year ago, James had begun noticing irregularities in material deliveries and construction processes. At first, the issue seemed minor: substitutions of slightly different materials, small deviations from approved construction methods. James had flagged these concerns in his reports, assuming they were simple mistakes that would be corrected once brought to management's attention. However, instead of addressing his concerns, Meridian's management had begun pressuring James to be more flexible in his inspections. His supervisors suggested that he was being overly meticulous, that minor variations from specifications were normal in the construction industry. They reminded him that the company's reputation depended on completing projects on time and under budget, and that excessive attention to minor details could jeopardize deadlines and budgets. The pressure intensified when James discovered that the minor material substitutions were actually systematic cost-cutting measures that compromised the structural integrity of the buildings. Meridian was using substandard steel, concrete with an incorrect ratio, and electrical components that didn't meet safety specifications. The savings from these substitutions were substantial, enough to significantly increase profit margins on every project. James opened his folder and carefully removed several documents, spreading them on the conference table. Emily could see official letterheads, technical specifications, and what appeared to be internal company memos. James explained that he had been documenting the violations for months, collecting evidence that showed a pattern of deliberate fraud rather than isolated incidents. The scope of the problem became clear as James detailed specific projects. Roosevelt Elementary School in Oak Park had been built with concrete that was 20% below specified strength. Mercy General Hospital's new wing used electrical components that had been rejected by inspectors in other states. The Davidson Municipal Building had steel supports that were a full grade below what the engineering plans required. Each of these shortcuts saved Meridian thousands of dollars per project, but they also created potential safety hazards for thousands of people. Attorney Ross had been listening intently, and I could see his skepticism giving way to genuine concern. He began asking specific questions about documentation, timelines, and James's attempts to address the issues through proper channels. James's answers were detailed and consistent, accompanied by documents that supported every claim he was making. The turning point in James's story came when he described his final attempt to work within the company's system. He had prepared a comprehensive report detailing all the violations he had documented, along with recommendations for immediate corrections and policy changes. He had presented this report to Meridian's senior management, believing that once they understood the scope of the problem, they would take corrective action. Instead, he was fired the next day. The official reason given was performance issues, but he was told privately that he was causing problems for the company and that his services were no longer needed. Within a week, he discovered that he had been blacklisted throughout the construction industry. Other companies were told that James was difficult to work with, unreliable, and prone to making false accusations against employers. The blacklisting had destroyed his career and financial stability. Unable to find work in his field, he had lost his apartment, his car, and eventually most of his possessions. For the past 6 months, he had been living in shelters and cheap motels, trying to figure out how to expose Meridian's fraud while surviving on odd jobs and occasional charity. But the personal cost wasn't what motivated James to seek legal help. What kept him awake at night was the knowledge that thousands of people were working, learning, and receiving medical care in buildings that might not be safe. Children attended school in structures with compromised foundations. Patients relied on a hospital with faulty electrical systems. City workers operated from a municipal building that might not withstand the next major storm. James explained that he had tried to contact government inspectors, but Meridian's relationships with local officials made it difficult to get anyone to take his allegations seriously. He had reached out to journalists, but without legal protection, he was afraid that speaking publicly would result in lawsuits that would destroy what little he had left. He needed legal representation to properly expose the fraud while protecting himself from retaliation. As James concluded his account, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't a simple contract dispute or a personal injury case. This was potential criminal fraud that could affect thousands of lives. She looked at Attorney Ross and could see that he was processing the implications of what James had revealed. The modest civil practice of Ross and Associates had never handled anything approaching this scale or complexity. Ross asked James why he had chosen their firm, given that there were larger practices with more resources and experience in corporate fraud cases. James's answer surprised both Emily and Ross. He explained that he had been observing the firm for several weeks, watching how they treated clients and conducted business. He had seen Emily's interactions with people who came to the office, noting her patience and genuine concern for others' welfare. James revealed that he had specifically sought out a smaller firm because he believed they would be more likely to take his case seriously, rather than viewing it as a potential profit opportunity. He had watched Emily help an elderly man fill out forms, had seen her spend extra time explaining legal processes to confused clients, and had observed her treating everyone with the same respect regardless of their appearance or financial situation. Emily realized that her instincts about James were correct. There was indeed more to his story than his disheveled appearance had suggested. But she also realized that by advocating for him, she had committed herself and Attorney Ross to a case that was far beyond anything they had ever handled. The folder in front of James contained evidence of fraud that could bring down a major corporation, but it also represented a legal battle that could consume their small firm's resources and potentially put them all in danger. As the implications of James's story sank in, Emily understood that her decision to fight for this stranger had set in motion events that would change not only her own life, but potentially the lives of thousands of people who depended on the integrity of the buildings where they worked, learned, and received care.
The silence in the conference room was heavy as Attorney Ross studied the documents James had spread across the table. Emily watched her boss's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to James's revelations. Ross picked up several of the papers, examining letterheads, technical specifications, and what appeared to be internal company communications. His expression had shifted from skepticism to serious concern as the scope of Meridian Construction's alleged fraud became clear. Emily found herself holding her breath as Ross reviewed the evidence. She realized that her career hung in the balance of his decision. If Ross determined that James's case lacked merit, Emily would face serious consequences for her insubordination earlier. But if the case was legitimate, she had potentially helped uncover one of the most significant construction fraud schemes in the region's history. James waited patiently as Ross examined the documents, occasionally answering technical questions about construction standards and inspection procedures. Emily was impressed by James's knowledge and attention to detail. His answers were precise and backed up by specific references to building codes and industry standards. This was clearly someone who understood his field thoroughly and had approached his documentation methodically. After nearly 20 minutes of review, Ross set down the papers and looked directly at James. His next words would determine not only James's future, but Emily's as well. Ross acknowledged that the evidence appeared substantial, and that the allegations, if true, represented serious violations that could endanger public safety. However, he also explained that taking on Meridian Construction would be like David facing Goliath. The company had vast legal resources and would fight aggressively to protect their reputation and business interests. They would likely attempt to discredit James personally, attack his credibility, and tie the case up in legal proceedings that could last for years. The firm's resources were limited, and going up against such a powerful opponent could potentially bankrupt Ross and Associates. Emily listened to Ross's realistic assessment of the situation, understanding that he was laying out legitimate concerns about taking on such a massive case. But she also noticed something else in his voice, a hint of excitement that she had never heard before. Despite his cautious words, Ross seemed energized by the prospect of tackling a case of this magnitude and importance. James responded to Ross's concerns with quiet dignity. He acknowledged that he understood the risks and that he didn't expect the firm to sacrifice their financial stability for his cause. However, he also pointed out that if they didn't act, the fraud would continue and more buildings would be constructed with substandard materials. He asked Ross to consider what would happen if one of those buildings failed during an emergency, or if a school collapsed because of compromised structural integrity. The weight of that responsibility hung in the air as Ross considered his decision. Emily realized that this was about more than legal fees or business considerations. This was about preventing potential disasters that could cost lives. She found herself thinking about the children who attended Roosevelt Elementary School, the patients at Mercy General Hospital, and the workers in the Davidson Municipal Building. All of these people were going about their daily lives, trusting that the buildings around them were safe and properly constructed. Ross asked James about his expectations for the case. Did he want financial compensation for his lost career? Was he seeking criminal prosecution of Meridian's executives? Was he hoping to force the company to repair or rebuild the compromised structures? James's answer revealed the depth of his character and the genuine nature of his motivations. James explained that his primary goal was to ensure that the affected buildings were properly inspected and repaired if necessary. He wanted Meridian Construction to be held accountable for their fraud and prevented from continuing these practices on future projects. While he hoped to clear his own name and potentially recover some compensation for his lost career, his main concern was public safety rather than personal gain. Emily felt a surge of admiration for James's priorities. Despite losing his job, his reputation, and his financial security, he was still focused on protecting others rather than seeking revenge against the company that had destroyed his life. She began to understand why her instincts had told her to fight for him. There was a fundamental decency about James that transcended his current circumstances. Ross stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below. Emily could almost see him weighing the decision in his mind. Taking James's case would transform their small practice overnight. They would be thrust into high-stakes litigation against a powerful corporation, dealing with media attention, political pressure, and legal challenges they had never faced before. The safe, predictable world of personal injury cases and contract disputes would be replaced by a battle that could make or break their careers.
But Emily also sensed that Ross was considering the opportunity this case represented. Success could establish Ross and Associates as a firm capable of handling major corporate fraud cases. It could bring prestige, recognition, and potentially significant financial rewards. More importantly, it could make a real difference in protecting public safety and holding a corrupt corporation accountable for their actions. When Ross turned back to face them, Emily could see that he had made his decision. He told James that Ross and Associates would take his case, but with specific conditions. First, James would need to cooperate fully with their investigation, providing access to any additional evidence he might have and being available for extensive preparation and testimony. Second, they would need to bring in additional legal expertise, which would require sharing fees with other attorneys who specialize in corporate fraud cases. Most importantly, Ross explained that they would need to move quickly and carefully. Meridian Construction would likely take aggressive action once they learned that James had found legal representation.
The company might attempt to destroy additional evidence, pressure witnesses, or take legal action to prevent the case from moving forward. They would need to be prepared for a long, difficult battle against opponents who would use every resource at their disposal to win. James agreed to all of Ross's conditions without hesitation. Emily could see the relief in his eyes as he realized that he finally had allies in his fight against Meridian Construction. For the first time since entering the office, James's shoulders relaxed slightly, and some of the fear that had been evident in his demeanor began to fade. Then Ross turned to Emily, and she braced herself for what he might say about her role in bringing this case to the firm. She had overstepped her authority as a receptionist, challenged her boss's judgment, and forced him into a decision he might not have made otherwise. Emily expected a reprimand, or at minimum, a reminder about professional boundaries and her place in the firm's hierarchy. Instead, Ross surprised her completely. He acknowledged that Emily's instincts about James had been correct, and that her willingness to fight for what she believed was right had potentially uncovered one of the most important cases the firm would ever handle. He told her that her passion and commitment had impressed him, and that he wanted her to play a significant role in the case moving forward. Ross explained that Emily's background and perspective would be valuable assets in their fight against Meridian Construction. Her understanding of financial struggles would help her connect with James and other potential witnesses who might be afraid to come forward. Her attention to detail and organizational skills would be crucial in managing the massive amount of documentation the case would require. Most importantly, her genuine concern for justice would help keep the legal team focused on their ultimate goal of protecting public safety. Emily felt overwhelmed by Ross's unexpected praise and the opportunity he was offering her. She had started the day as a receptionist studying for the LSAT in her spare time, and she was ending it as a key member of a legal team taking on corporate fraud. The transformation felt surreal, but she also felt a sense of rightness about it, as if her decision to fight for James had revealed something about herself that she hadn't known was there. As they discussed the practical aspects of moving forward with the case, Emily realized that her life was about to change dramatically. She would need to learn about corporate law, fraud investigation, and litigation strategies far more complex than anything she had encountered in her LSAT preparation. She would be working longer hours, facing more stress, and potentially putting herself at risk from a powerful corporation that didn't want their secrets exposed. But Emily also realized that for the first time since starting work at Ross & Associates, she felt truly energized and purposeful. She wasn't just answering phones and filing paperwork. She was part of something that mattered, something that could make a real difference in people's lives. The case would challenge her in ways she had never experienced, but it would also give her the opportunity to use her skills and passion for justice in meaningful ways. James thanked both Emily and Ross for their willingness to take on his case. He explained that he had almost given up hope of finding legal representation, and that Emily's advocacy had saved not only his case, but potentially the lives of people who would be affected by Meridian's continued fraud. Emily felt the weight of that responsibility, but also the satisfaction of knowing that her decision to stand up for what was right had led to this moment. As they prepared to conclude the meeting, Ross outlined the next steps in their investigation. They would need to secure James's evidence, reach out to potential witnesses, and begin building a comprehensive case against Meridian Construction. They would also need to prepare for the company's inevitable counterattack, which would likely include attempts to discredit James and potentially legal action against the firm itself. Emily left the office that evening with her mind racing and her heart pounding. The rain had stopped, and the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement as she walked to her car. She thought about how the day had started, routine, predictable, ordinary, and how it was ending with her life completely transformed. She had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known was there, the courage to fight for what was right, even when it meant risking everything she had worked for. The case against Meridian Construction would test Emily in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but she felt ready for the challenge. She had taken the first step toward becoming the lawyer she had always dreamed of being, not by passing the LSAT or enrolling in law school, but by standing up for justice when it mattered most.
3 months after James Wilson had walked through the doors of Ross and Associates, Emily's life bore little resemblance to the quiet, predictable routine she had known before. The small law firm had been transformed into a bustling headquarters for what had become known in legal circles as the Meridian Construction whistleblower case. Emily's simple reception desk had been replaced by multiple workstations covered with documents, photographs, and computer monitors displaying construction blueprints and building inspection reports. Emily herself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. No longer just a receptionist, she had become the case's primary coordinator, managing witness interviews, organizing evidence, and serving as the liaison between Ross and Associates and the team of specialized attorneys they had brought in to handle different aspects of the complex litigation. Her LSAT prep books had been replaced by legal texts on corporate fraud, construction law, and whistleblower protections. The case had attracted the attention of the State Attorney General's office, which had launched its own criminal investigation into Meridian Construction's practices. Federal agencies had also become involved, as several of the compromised buildings had been constructed with government funding. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to expose corporate fraud had grown into a multi-jurisdictional investigation that threatened to bring down one of the region's largest construction companies. Emily's role in the case had evolved naturally as her capabilities became apparent to the legal team. Her organizational skills proved invaluable in managing the thousands of documents that needed to be reviewed, cataloged, and analyzed. Her empathy and communication abilities made her effective at interviewing potential witnesses, who were often afraid to come forward against such a powerful company. Most importantly, her genuine passion for the case helped maintain the team's motivation during the long hours and intense pressure they faced. James had become more than just a client. He had become Emily's mentor in understanding the construction industry and the technical aspects of building safety. Despite the personal cost he had paid for his decision to speak out, James remained focused on ensuring that every detail of Meridian's fraud was properly documented and presented. Emily had learned to read construction blueprints, understand materials specifications, and recognize the signs of substandard work that James had originally identified. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Meridian Construction had indeed fought back aggressively, hiring one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms and launching a comprehensive attack on James's credibility. They had filed defamation lawsuits, attempted to have James arrested on fabricated charges, and used their political connections to pressure government officials to drop their investigations. Emily had experienced this corporate warfare firsthand when private investigators began following her, photographing her daily activities, and conducting background checks on her family and friends. Her phone had been hacked, her apartment had been burglarized, though nothing was stolen, and she had received anonymous threats warning her to stay away from the case. The intimidation tactics were designed to frighten her away from her involvement in the litigation. Instead of backing down, Emily had found these attacks strengthening her resolve. She realized that Meridian's desperate tactics were proof that the case was having an impact, and that the company was genuinely afraid of what the investigation might reveal. Each attempt at intimidation reminded her of why the case mattered, and reinforced her commitment to seeing it through to its conclusion. The legal team's investigation had uncovered evidence far beyond what James had originally documented. They discovered that Meridian's fraud extended back more than 5 years and affected dozens of buildings across 3 states. The company had developed sophisticated methods for hiding their cost-cutting measures, bribing inspectors, and falsifying documentation to cover their tracks. More disturbingly, the investigation revealed that Meridian executives were aware of the safety risks their practices created. Internal emails showed company officials joking about cutting corners and discussing ways to minimize liability if their substandard construction was ever discovered. The evidence painted a picture of a corporate culture that prioritized profits over public safety, with a callousness that shocked even experienced fraud attorneys. Emily's work on the case had not gone unnoticed by the legal community. Several law schools had reached out to her about accelerated admission programs, recognizing her practical experience and demonstrated commitment to public interest law. Major law firms had also expressed interest in recruiting her, impressed by her role in one of the most significant corporate fraud cases in recent memory. But Emily had come to realize that her future lay not in corporate law or even traditional legal practice, but in advocacy work that combined legal strategy with genuine concern for social justice.
She had discovered a passion for protecting ordinary people from corporate abuse and holding powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The case had also deepened Emily's relationship with attorney Ross, who had become both a mentor and a collaborative partner in their fight against Meridian. Ross had acknowledged that Emily's instincts and dedication had transformed not only the case, but his own practice and perspective on the law. He had begun transitioning the firm toward more public interest work, recognizing that their success with the Meridian case had opened doors to other meaningful litigation opportunities. As Emily reflected on her transformation, she realized that her decision to stand up for James that rainy Thursday afternoon had revealed capabilities and passions she hadn't known she possessed. She had always thought of herself as someone who followed rules and avoided confrontation, but the case had shown her that she was capable of taking on powerful opponents when justice was at stake. The most rewarding aspect of Emily's transformation had been the relationships she had developed with other whistleblowers and victims who had come forward as the case gained publicity. Former Meridian employees had contacted the firm with additional evidence of fraud. Parents of children who attended Roosevelt Elementary had joined the case as plaintiffs. Hospital workers from Mercy General had provided testimony about safety concerns they had observed but been afraid to report. Emily had become the primary point of contact for these witnesses, helping them navigate the legal process while protecting them from Meridian's retaliation attempts. She had learned to provide both legal guidance and emotional support to people who were taking enormous personal risks to support the case. These relationships had taught her that the law was not just about statutes and procedures, but about real people whose lives were affected by corporate decisions and legal outcomes. The case had also taught Emily about the broader implications of corporate fraud and the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable. She had come to understand that Meridian's practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of corporate behavior that put profits ahead of public safety. The case represented an opportunity to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated, and that there were consequences for companies that betrayed the public trust. As the case moved toward trial, Emily felt both nervous and excited about the challenges ahead. She knew that Meridian would continue fighting aggressively and that the trial would be a grueling test of everything the legal team had prepared. But she also felt confident that they had built a strong case based on solid evidence and compelling testimony from credible witnesses. Emily's transformation from receptionist to legal advocate had been rapid and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been deeply fulfilling. She had discovered her true calling not through careful career planning or academic study, but through a spontaneous decision to do what she believed was right. That decision had set in motion a chain of events that had not only changed her own life, but had potentially saved the lives of countless people who depended on the safety of the buildings where they worked, learned, and received care. The young woman who had once worried about paying her student loans and dreamed of someday attending law school had become someone who was making a real difference in the world. Emily had learned that sometimes the most important legal education doesn't happen in a classroom, but in the real world, where courage and conviction matter more than credentials and connections.
2 years after James Wilson first walked through the doors of Ross & Associates, Emily Parker stood on the courthouse steps facing a crowd of reporters, cameras, and supporters who had gathered to hear the final outcome of what had become the largest construction fraud case in Illinois history. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before returning with a verdict that would forever change not only the lives of those directly involved in the case, but the construction industry's approach to safety and accountability. Meridian Construction had been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and endangering public safety. The company was ordered to pay $150 million in damages, with additional funds required for the complete reconstruction of all compromised buildings. More importantly, several Meridian executives, including the CEO, were sentenced to prison terms for their role in the systematic fraud that have endangered thousands of lives. Emily watched as James Wilson addressed the media, his transformation as remarkable as her own. The desperate, frightened man who had once stood dripping in their lobby had become a confident advocate for construction industry reform. James had been vindicated, completely, his reputation restored, and his courage in speaking out recognized as having prevented what could have been catastrophic building failures.
The investigation had revealed just how close some of the buildings had come to disaster. Engineers discovered that Roosevelt Elementary School's foundation had stress fractures that could have led to collapse during the next major earthquake. Mercy General Hospital's electrical systems had been on the verge of causing fires that could have trapped patients. The Davidson Municipal Building's structural integrity was so compromised that it had to be evacuated immediately and completely rebuilt. As Emily reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, she realized that the case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom victory. The Meridian investigation had led to comprehensive reforms in construction oversight, with new regulations requiring independent inspection and verification systems. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened, making it easier for industry professionals to report safety violations without fear of retaliation. The case had also established important legal precedents for holding corporations accountable when their pursuit of profits endangered public safety. Other whistleblower cases had followed, with attorneys across the country using the Meridian precedent to take on similar corporate fraud. Emily had testified before legislative committees, spoken at legal conferences, and consulted on other cases involving corporate misconduct. For Emily personally, the case had opened doors she had never imagined possible. She had been accepted to law school with a full scholarship, but had decided to defer enrollment to continue her work with Ross & Associates, which had evolved into a specialized public interest firm focusing on corporate accountability cases. She had discovered that her true calling lay not in traditional legal practice, but in the intersection of investigation, advocacy, and social justice. The firm had taken on cases involving pharmaceutical companies hiding drug side effects, financial institutions engaging in predatory lending, and environmental polluters covering up toxic contamination. In each case, Emily's role had been to identify and support the whistleblowers and victims who made these cases possible, helping them navigate the legal system while protecting them from corporate retaliation. Emily had also established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and teaching ordinary citizens how to recognize and report corporate fraud. The organization provided legal resources, financial assistance, and emotional support to people who chose to speak out against corporate wrongdoing despite personal risks. As the crowd began to disperse from the courthouse steps, Emily found herself standing alone with James, both of them reflecting on how their lives had been changed by their chance encounter 2 years earlier. James told Emily that her decision to fight for him that day had not only saved his case, but had restored his faith in the fundamental decency of people and the possibility that justice could prevail against overwhelming odds. James had used his settlement money to establish a construction safety foundation that provided training and support for industry professionals who wanted to maintain high ethical standards. He had become a sought-after consultant on construction safety and fraud prevention, traveling around the country to speak at conferences and train inspectors. Emily realized that the most important lesson of their journey was not about legal strategies or corporate fraud, but about the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences when they choose to act on their convictions. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. The case had taught Emily that the legal system, despite its flaws and complexities, could be a powerful tool for protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. But it had also taught her that the system only worked when individuals were willing to take risks, speak truth to power, and stand up for what they believed was right. Looking back on that rainy Thursday afternoon when she had first decided to challenge Attorney Ross's decision, Emily understood that she had been at a crossroads without knowing it. She could have remained silent, accepted her boss's judgment, and continued with her quiet, predictable life. Instead, she had chosen to trust her instincts and fight for a stranger, setting in motion events that had transformed multiple lives and potentially saved many others. The Meridian case had become a landmark example of how whistleblower protection laws could work when supported by dedicated legal representation and public attention. It had demonstrated that even the largest and most powerful corporations could be held accountable when their actions endangered public safety. Most importantly, it had shown that ordinary people, a struggling construction inspector, a small-town receptionist, and a modest attorney, could take on corporate giants and win when they were motivated by genuine concern for justice. Emily's story had become an inspiration for others facing similar crossroads in their own lives. She had received letters from people around the country who had been inspired by her example to speak out against wrongdoing in their own communities. Some were employees who had reported safety violations, others were citizens who had challenged corrupt local officials, and still others were simply people who had decided to stand up for what they believed was right, despite personal costs. As the crowd began to disperse from the courthouse steps, Emily found herself standing alone with James, both of them reflecting on how their lives had been changed by their chance encounter 2 years earlier. James told Emily that her decision to fight for him that day had not only saved his case, but had restored his faith in the fundamental decency of people and the possibility that justice could prevail against overwhelming odds. James had used his settlement money to establish a construction safety foundation that provided training and support for industry professionals who wanted to maintain high ethical standards. He had become a sought-after consultant on construction safety and fraud prevention, traveling around the country to speak at conferences and train inspectors. Emily realized that the most important lesson of their journey was not about legal strategies or corporate fraud, but about the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences when they choose to act on their convictions. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. The case had taught Emily that the legal system, despite its flaws and complexities, could be a powerful tool for protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. But it had also taught her that the system only worked when individuals were willing to take risks, speak truth to power, and stand up for what they believed was right. Looking back on that rainy Thursday afternoon when she had first decided to challenge Attorney Ross's decision, Emily understood that she had been at a crossroads without knowing it. She could have remained silent, accepted her boss's judgment, and continued with her quiet, predictable life. Instead, she had chosen to trust her instincts and fight for a stranger, setting in motion events that had transformed multiple lives and potentially saved many others. The Meridian case had become a landmark example of how whistleblower protection laws could work when supported by dedicated legal representation and public attention. It had demonstrated that even the largest and most powerful corporations could be held accountable when their actions endangered public safety. Most importantly, it had shown that ordinary people, a struggling construction inspector, a small-town receptionist, and a modest attorney could take on corporate giants and win when they were motivated by genuine concern for justice. Emily's story had become an inspiration for others facing similar crossroads in their own lives. She received letters from people around the country who had been inspired by her example to speak out against wrongdoing in their own communities. Some were employees who had reported safety violations, others were citizens who had challenged corrupt local officials, and still others were simply people who had decided to stand up for what they believed was right despite personal costs. As the crowd began to disperse from the courthouse steps, Emily found herself standing alone with James, both of them reflecting on how their lives had been changed by their chance encounter 2 years earlier. James told Emily that her decision to fight for him that day had not only saved his case, but had restored his faith in the fundamental decency of people and the possibility that justice could prevail against overwhelming odds. James had used his settlement money to establish a construction safety foundation that provided training and support for industry professionals who wanted to maintain high ethical standards. He had become a sought-after consultant on construction safety and fraud prevention, traveling around the country to speak at conferences and train inspectors.
Emily realized that the most important lesson of their journey was not about legal strategies or corporate fraud, but about the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences when they choose to act on their convictions. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. The case had taught Emily that the legal system, despite its flaws and complexities, could be a powerful tool for protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable.
But it had also taught her that the system only worked when individuals were willing to take risks, speak truth to power, and stand up for what they believed was right. Looking back on that rainy Thursday afternoon when she had first decided to challenge Attorney Ross's decision, Emily understood that she had been at a crossroads without knowing it. She could have remained silent, accepted her boss's judgment, and continued with her quiet, predictable life. Instead, she had chosen to trust her instincts and fight for a stranger, setting in motion events that had transformed multiple lives and potentially saved many others. The Meridian case had become a landmark example of how whistleblower protection laws could work when supported by dedicated legal representation and public attention. It had demonstrated that even the largest and most powerful corporations could be held accountable when their actions endangered public safety. Most importantly, it had shown that ordinary people, a struggling construction inspector, a small-town receptionist, and a modest attorney could take on corporate giants and win when they were motivated by genuine concern for justice. Emily's story had become an inspiration for others facing similar crossroads in their own lives. She received letters from people around the country who had been inspired by her example to speak out against wrongdoing in their own communities. Some were employees who had reported safety violations. Others were citizens who had challenged corrupt local officials, and still others were simply people who had decided to stand up for what they believed was right, despite personal costs. As Emily walked away from the courthouse that day, she carried with her the knowledge that her decision to defend James Wilson had created ripple effects that would continue long after the headlines faded and the case was closed. The buildings that had been rebuilt would serve their communities safely for decades. The regulatory reforms would prevent similar fraud in the future. The legal precedents would help other whistleblowers seek justice. But perhaps most importantly, Emily's story would continue to inspire others to find their own courage when faced with moments that demanded moral leadership. She had learned that being an ordinary person was not a limitation, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that extraordinary impact could come from anyone willing to choose courage over comfort, principle over pragmatism. Emily Parker had started as a receptionist who dreamed of becoming a lawyer someday. Through her willingness to stand up for what she believed was right, she had become something much more valuable. An advocate for justice who understood that the most important legal battles are won not just in courtrooms, but in the everyday moments when individuals choose to do what is right despite the personal cost. The rain had stopped falling, both literally and metaphorically, and Emily walked toward a future filled with purpose, knowing that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simple decision to listen to your conscience and act on your convictions, regardless of the consequences.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.